Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a philosophy podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Welcome, Dave Ripley.
Howdy.
Hey. So, you are a professor at Monash University?
I'm a lecturer at Monash University. Yep.
Okay. Which is in Melbourne?
Which is in Melbourne, in Australia.
Melbourne.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And so could you, before we get started on any specific topic, could you just tell me a bit about your career as a philosopher, as a logician? What are your interests? What have you worked on?
Yeah. My undergraduate degree isn't in philosophy. My undergraduate degree is in linguistics. But I did end up studying some philosophy as part of that, connected to that. And I kind of came over into philosophy that way, by studying language, by asking questions about meaning in natural language, by trying to think about how we can use sort of formal tools of various sorts to build models of and understand what we're actually doing when we're running around talking and doing that sort of stuff. So where I've tended to focus in my work is on paradoxes of various sorts, paradoxes to do with vagueness, paradoxes to do with truth, validity, these sorts of things. But there are lots of different ways that you can be interested in these paradoxes, and the way that I've sort of been motivated to pursue them and to think about them is as posing challenges for giving a reasonable theory of what various words mean. So for a sort of simple case, thinking about like a paradox of vagueness, as, okay, this thing is red, well, the next thing's only a little bit different in color, so it's red, and then the next thing's only a little bit different in color, so it's red, and so on. And it looks like if you chain that all together, you get horrible conclusions. It turns out everything is red or nothing is red. But each step of it seems in some sense guaranteed by what the word red means. It looks like the word red, as a matter of its meaning, can't draw a sharp line between two things that look exactly the same or look almost exactly the same. And so there's lots of ways to engage with the paradox of vagueness, but I've tried to engage with it as a challenge to a reasonable theory of meaning for the words involved. And when it comes to paradoxes involving truth and other notions like the Curry paradox that we're going to be talking about in a bit, I've been motivated to engage with them by the same kinds of concerns, as posing a challenge to reasonable theories of what the words involved in these paradoxes mean. So my motivation is coming from that sort of linguistic, natural language background, but the tools that I've used to explore it are these various sort of formal and logical tools that are maybe a bit more abstract. Gotcha.
Actually, that's without delaying the main topic too much, I find that already an interesting comment to make. What do you think are sort of other broad ways that you could approach these kinds of paradoxes where the focus isn't on the meaning of the words?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways you might come at them. One of them, and I think this is not a terribly uncommon way to think about the paradoxes, is as something like an engineering challenge, right? Where you think, okay, either the languages we actually speak run smack into the paradoxes and so we're in serious trouble and unsuitable for systematic use, or maybe who knows about the languages we actually speak, but we might want to design formal languages for certain purposes. But if we design them in these ways, they'll run smack into the paradoxes and so be unsuitable for, trying to regiment our thinking according to or something. And if you think of things that way, you've got a kind of lot more degrees of freedom in response, or you're sort of, right, it becomes a practical problem of designing a language that can avoid the paradoxes. And you've got lots of options for ways to do that, right? There's absolutely no shortage of formal languages that have been built in ways that enable them not to run into the paradoxes. And so you start comparing those in this very sort of pragmatic way, and you think, okay, well, what am I designing a language to do, and which of these best serves those purposes? Am I designing something to be a foundation of mathematics? Am I designing something for regimenting scientific theorizing? Anyway, it becomes this sort of practical question. I certainly don't think that sort of descriptive questions about natural language or in general, descriptive theorizing is completely free of practical influence. But I think if you're exploring language, you end up much more constrained by things like how do people actually use these words? What are the entailments that people genuinely believe these words to undergo, right? Judgments of entailment are one of the key pieces of data that's input to serious semantic theorizing. And so, again, it's not like practical concerns are sort of totally absent, but it's you have less of a free hand. You're sort of answerable to the empirical evidence, or I want to be answerable to the empirical evidence, in a way that if I saw it as a sort of mere is strong, in the way that I saw it as just an engineering problem, then who really cares about the empirical evidence? We're just trying to design something that works for a purpose. Similarly, I think a lot of people who think seriously about paradoxes and who think seriously about paradoxes using the kinds of tools I use, the tools of formal logic, often have views about what logic is, or what, sometimes they write logic with a capital L to mean like logic itself. And I just have no idea what logic is. I have no views about what logic is. I'm not making any claims about what logic is, or what logical truth is, or logical consequence, or anything like that. Right? I'm just trying to understand how meaning operates in natural languages, and I see the paradoxes as posing a certain kind of challenge to that. So I end up remaining neutral on a lot of these views about what logic is, that many other people studying things in the same area are actually, these are in some ways some of the central questions for a lot of other people in this area, right? What is logic? What logic should we adopt? I'm not 100% sure I understand those questions, but to the extent that I understand them, I think I'm pretty neutral on them. And really my questions are orthogonal, although I end up a fellow traveler with a lot of people asking those questions because we're using the same tools to explore the same kind of phenomena, just for different reasons.
Now, again, at the risk of dragging you into something that you just said you don't have any opinions about, isn't there, or at least isn't there potentially, essentially, isn't some of logic sort of implicit in some of the semantics of natural language, right? Like if you really sort of listen to the way that people not only speak and mean, but sort of reason, I think is kind of part of that. You can sort of, that I don't think is going to give you an answer to what is logic or what is the right logic, but it's sort of, that already does give you some constraints, it seems, on some of the answers to those questions, no?
I mean, I tend to think of reasoning as a pretty separate kind of question. So the paradoxes certainly raise problems for various systematic theories of how people reason, or of how people ought to reason. But the connection between reasoning, either actual reasoning or ideal reasoning, whichever of those you're concerned with, the connection between either of those and the meanings of our words is, I think, at best indirect. Right? So it might be that some reasoning is such that, as a matter of the meaning of the words involved, it can never go wrong, or something like that. So there's some possible connection to some kinds of reasoning. But when you ask about what sort of reasoning should we engage in, I don't think a plausible response to that starts from that reasoning such that, as a matter of the meanings of the words involved in it, it can never go wrong. Right? The reasoning that we should engage in is probably comes apart from that in at least two ways. One, it's going to be riskier. We ought to draw all kinds of conclusions that don't have anything like that strong guarantee, just in order to be able to sort of get around in our day-to-day. And two, we probably ought not to engage in a lot of the reasoning that does have that kind of strong guarantee, because it would largely be useless. And so if you think about, if I suppose I thought that A or B follows from A, as a matter of the meaning of or, right, for any A and any B, well, I shouldn't just take anything I believe and then actually go through the reasoning, because reasoning is, an activity that people do. And so I shouldn't then go through the reasoning to add on every possible disjunct to that. Like, that would just be a waste of time. Maybe some of those are useful for other purposes, or things I should go to, but in general, I shouldn't. So I think if you're thinking about ideal reasoning anyway, it looks like we ought to engage in reasoning that doesn't have this tight connection to meaning, and we ought not to engage in all the reasoning that does have the tight connection. And then I think if you look at actual reasoning, probably the connections are even more indirect. So it's not like reasoning's irrelevant. Obviously, it's involved in the paradox, is obviously, I mean, one, you just need to reason about the paradoxes, right? What you're engaged in is reasoning, of course, in some sense, but the paradoxes also themselves pose a kind of challenge for some theories of reasoning people might want to give. But I think the connection's really at best indirect. And if you think that capital L logic, whatever that is, bears some kind of tie to reasoning, well, then it's something that I'm far less likely to have much sort of constructive to say about. I don't. As I say, I think of reasoning as a process that people actually go through, one that's absolutely worthy of study and receives a ton of study, but is something that I only know some things about and is not really a central focus for me.
Got it. So, without further ado, I wanted to speak with you about Curry's paradox. And I'm excited to do this. I pretty much since I first conceived of starting this podcast, I thought, I was thinking through, well, it's titled "Who Shaves the Barber," right? I was kind of thinking, what are some paradoxes? And I thought, like, Curry's would be really interesting. But immediately the next thought was, it would also really be a challenge. It seems a particularly technical paradox, and while there's definitely kind of intuition there to sort through, I think it's a little bit less accessible than, say, the liar or the sororities to kind of get to that. But we're going to try it. So, so I guess let me just ask you first to kind of, if you could run through what the problematic sort of Curry argument is.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different ones. So you can already see this in this respect, and in many, many respects, the Curry is a great deal like the liar paradox. I agree that it's more complicated in some ways, but I think you can sort of see the source of the complication right in the sentences that give rise to it. So the liar paradox has different formulations, but one particularly kind of nice and clean one to work with is based around a sentence that says of itself that it isn't true. So a sentence that says, this sentence, am not true. So it turns on this notion of negation, the not that's in there, as well as truth and self-reference, but I want to focus on the negation aspect of it. The Curry paradox is going to take the very same sort of thing, but instead of working with negation or not, it works with a conditional, an if-then. And so a Curry sentence is going to be a sentence that says of itself that if it's true, then blah. And you can fill in whatever you like for blah. There's variant Curry paradoxes any which way we want to go. So imagine a Curry paradox that starts from, I don't know, if this sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. But you don't have to fill in something false as the consequent, but it's what happens with the Curry paradox is you get something that looks like a proof of that consequent comes out, whatever the consequent is. So it helps to make it kind of, it's more obviously a problem if you fill in something false, because then you get a thing that looks like a proof of a false thing. If you put in a true thing, we can get there. But if you start with a false thing, that works. So you start from a sentence like, if this sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And you can just see that's just a more complex sentence, right? If then has two components. It's got the ify bit, the antecedent, and the then-y bit, the consequent. And negation, the not, only takes one thing. There's just one thing that isn't. So it's that difference between 1 and 2 that really, I think, is what makes the Curry paradox more elaborate than the liar paradox. But for both of these paradoxes, there's lots of different ways that you can start from that sentence, start from the existence of that sentence, and build an argument that looks like it gets you somewhere it shouldn't. And in fact, the ways are pretty related back and forth. For any kind of usual way of getting trouble from the Curry paradox, there's a corresponding usual way to get trouble from the liar, and vice versa. So I'll offer one way to get to trouble from the Curry paradox, but just with the note that there's a whole lot of others as well out there. But this is a very standard one. So you need a few ingredients to get it up and rolling. One of them, and this is controversial if you're thinking about truth, but it's controversial precisely because it leads to paradoxes. So let's make the assumption to see how it leads to paradoxes, is that the claim that a particular sentence is true is in some sense equivalent to that sentence itself. So the classic example here that Tarski offers along these lines is an equivalence between, on the one hand, the claim that snow is white, and on the other hand, the claim that the sentence, quote, snow is white, end quote, is the true sentence. Right, he offers this equivalence going back and forth between snow is white and, quote, snow is white, end quote, is true. And that's one example, but this is meant to be a sort of general story about how truth might work. So let's take that on board as an assumption, that we can treat each sentence as equivalent to a sentence that claims that that first sentence is true. So that's one of the ingredients we need. The other ingredients we need are some principles for reasoning about conditionals, for reasoning about if-then. And because it's if-then that's going to play a really core part of what's going on here. So here are some ingredients that you might want to put forward for if-then. These are very standard in theories of conditionals of various sorts, although of course they can be questioned. Let's go this way. So one way to do it is going to use the following two assumptions. The first assumption is something like a principle of modus ponens. So from a conditional, if A then B, together with its antecedent A, we can conclude its consequent B. So for example, in the case of the Curry sentence that says, if I'm true, then 0 equals 1, what we would think is, okay, to get from that sentence, if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1, together with its antecedent, the Curry sentence is true, we should be able to conclude 0 equals 1. That's an instance of modus ponens, right? You take a conditional, you put it together with its antecedent, and you get its consequent. So let's just think about that. There's one more ingredient that we'll need about the conditional, but for now, let's just start there. So we've got this instance of modus ponens. If the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1, together with the Curry sentence is true, therefore 0 equals 1. Now, if you think about the second premise of that argument, that second premise was the Curry sentence is true. And we say, okay, that's a good argument. If its premises are true, then its conclusion must follow, right? The conclusion somehow comes out of those premises. But that second premise says that the Curry sentence is true. And by an assumption that we've made about truth, to say that the Curry sentence is true is equivalent to just saying the Curry sentence itself. So our first premise was the Curry sentence itself. Our first premise was, if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And our second premise was the Curry sentence is true, but we can now replace that with the Curry sentence itself by our assumption about truth. So now we have two premises, but they're exactly the same. They're both the Curry sentence, right? So the first premise says if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. The second premise is the Curry sentence. So it also says if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And that conclusion, 0 equals 1, we've decided follows from this. So this comes from modus ponens, and one use of replacing that truth claim with the sentence it's claiming is true. So, so here we go. Now, another plausible assumption coming in from the wings here is that if we have a good argument with two premises and a conclusion, but those two premises are exactly the same sentence as each other, then we don't really need to assume it twice or take it as a premise twice, right? You just take your premises once and then you use them as many times as you need. So assuming we can do that, we can simplify this, right? We don't just go from two instances of the Curry sentence to 0 equals 1, but we just go directly from the Curry sentence to 0 equals 1. So where we've got to now is to say, from the premise, if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1, we can draw the conclusion 0 equals 1. From the Curry sentence to its consequent. Now, okay, we still need one more assumption about conditionals that I'll bring in a minute. But before we get there, let's take one additional step. So here we are, we have from the Curry sentence to 0 equals 1. And again, by our assumption about truth, we ought to be able to replace that premise with the claim that it itself is true. Because everything's treated as equivalent to the claim that it's true. So we replace the Curry sentence, which we had as a premise, with the Curry sentence is true as our premise. And we now have this much smaller argument, which, remember, at base, it's still just coming from modus ponens, right? All we've done is sort of process our modus ponens and simplify it down, kind of boil it down. But we get down to this very simple argument with one premise and one conclusion. And its premise is the Curry sentence is true. And its conclusion is 0 equals 1. Now, from here, here's the other assumption about conditionals I want to wing in, which is if you've got a good argument from A to B, then that itself constitutes a proof of the conditional if A then B. And if you think about how we day to day try to argue for conditionals, suppose you tell someone if you drop that glass, it'll break. And they say, well, why should I believe that? And you try to offer them reasons, and you say, okay, well, look, suppose you drop it, then because of gravity, it's going to fall, and it's going to hit the floor, and the floor is hard, and the glass is fragile. So, a fragile thing hits a hard thing at speed, and it shatters all over the place, and so it'll be broken. What you've done is you've reasoned from the person dropping it to its breaking. It's the usual way we use to try to establish conditional claims. We reason from the antecedent to the consequent. And if we can get a good chain of reasoning from the antecedent to the consequent, we say, okay, well, that shows that the conditional is right. So returning to our Curry example, we've got good reasoning, given the assumptions we brought on board so far. We've got good reasoning from the claim that the Curry sentence is true to the claim that 0 equals 1. So we treat that good reasoning as demonstrating the conditional itself. So what we've now done is prove the Curry sentence. We've proved if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And now there's a bit of trouble. So what we started out with, remember, was all these assumptions about get this good argument, this modus ponens good argument together, blah, blah, blah. Run through all of it, we get out at the end, or at where we are so far, and this proof of the Curry sentence itself. If the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And now essentially what we do is we run through the same reasoning again, but no longer under supposition. Now we're in full voice. We proved the Curry sentence. And so, appealing to truth reasoning, we've proved that the Curry sentence is true. Again, that's another appeal to that truth equivalence. So we've proved this conditional, if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And we've proved its antecedent. We've proved the Curry sentence is true. So appealing to modus ponens, we've proved that 0 equals 1. So that's a really long-winded way to go through it. But I've tried to sort of call attention to what's happening at each step. We've basically used, well, I don't know how you want to count ingredients, but one way to think of that is we've used at least the following 4 ingredients. We've assumed that the claim that a sentence is true is equivalent to the sentence itself. Used that a few times. We've used modus ponens, this idea that a conditional together with its antecedent suffice to establish its consequent. We've used this weird little assumption, it goes under the name contraction, that if we have a good argument with 2 instances of the very same premise, then we can throw one of them out and just make do with 1 instance of that premise. And we've used this conditional principle where if I can give you a good argument from the antecedent to the consequent, then that is itself sufficing to establish the conditional itself. And depending on how you go about it, like I said, there are lots of ways to present that reasoning, but that's one way to look at where the problem might come from. So yeah, that's the sort of long-winded but somewhat careful version.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because I think that does a really good job of sort of explaining the sort of intuitive flow of that argument. And I think you made this clear, but just to reiterate, sort of just in case, sort of the first half roughly, or 2/3 of what you went through was just kind of assuming, let's just suppose that we have the Curry sentence and then see what follows from that, right? And what followed from that was that 0 equals 1. That whole then argument sort of showed us that this Curry sentence is true. And so actually we can take it for granted. We sort of did it as a sort of, let's just suppose, but now we really do have it. And so we can sort of run through the same thing again and now get that unwanted conclusion.
That's it exactly. I think of it as a sort of Nightmare on Elm Street kind of situation, right? Where, you know, if Freddy kills you in your dream, it turns out to kill you in reality, right? So you start out under supposition, you start out going through this reasoning, and you get to 0 = 1, but you say, oh, it's only under supposition, it's only a dream, no problem. And that's when all of a sudden it turns out you discharge the supposition, you break out into reality, and that's when the real trouble comes.
Right. So, uh, you mentioned that you see the lyre and the curry as being very similar.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And you also mentioned that, you know, usually the ways that you have of running through the argument for one of them will have a kind of analogous version.
Yep.
And since you just went through the informal reasoning of Curry, I wonder if you could try to spell out where you see the analogues to, you know, in a kind of run through of the lyre.
Yeah. So one thing, so sometimes when people are talking about paradoxes, and particularly when they're talking about liar paradoxes, they'll sort of center on this divide between classical logic and non-classical logic, and sort of present it as though, well, of course, these paradoxes arise in classical logic, but this is why we need to go to a non-classical logic. And there's something to those arguments. I've got my questions about them, but there's something to them. But anyway, the point I want to make about that at the moment is that paradoxes like the lyre and like the curry definitely don't just arise in classical logic. They also arise in a range of non-classical logics. And so, in particular, intuitionistic logic, one of the earliest developed non-classical logics, as one of the earliest formally developed non-classical logics, is weaker than classical logic, doesn't validate every argument classical logic does, but is as powerless against the paradoxes as classical logic is. So if classical logic has a response, so does intuitionist logic. But if classical logic doesn't, then neither does intuitionistic logic, right? It runs smack into the paradoxes in the same way. So the argument that I just gave you for the Curry paradox is one that would go through just as well in intuitionistic logic as it would in classical logic. The assumptions made about the conditional in that argument are not distinctively classical. And one thing you'll see in the argument, the parallel argument for the lyre that I'll give you in just a moment, is it's exactly the same. That is, it also will go through an intuitionistic logic as well as classical logic. The assumptions it makes about negation are not distinctively classical. There are other standard ways to go with the lyre that you get in trouble that do require classical logic, or at least can't be done in intuitionistic logic. And they also have parallel ways of dealing with curry that do require classical logic and can't be done in intuitionistic logic. But just to point out, we're here in this constructive and intuitionistic area. These paradoxes still arise, and they still arise for curry for that reason, the reason we just went over, and for the lyre for this reason, the reason I'm about to present. So take a lyre sentence. This sentence is not true. Corresponding to modus ponens, what we have in the case of the lyre sentence is, let's see, let's do it as a proof that 0 = 1. Why not? That'll be fun. So we'll have, for the lyre sentence, this principle of explosion. So a principle of explosion says that from a sentence, together with its own negation, you can conclude anything you want. And so what we want, no. Sorry. Rewire. No, let's do this simpler. From a sentence together with its negation, all we need to really conclude is the conjunction of that sentence together with its negation. Right, so this is an instance of from A together with B, we conclude A and B. From a sentence A together with not A, we conclude A and not A. And so in particular, from the lyre sentence is not true, together with the lyre sentence is true, we conclude the lyre sentence is true and the lyre sentence is not true, just conjoining them together. Now we do the same mucking about with the premises that we did before. So we've gone from the lyre sentence is not true and the lyre sentence is true to this contradictory conjunction, the claim that the lyre sentence is true and the lyre sentence is not true. So now we operate on the premises, take that second premise, the premise that said the lyre sentence is true. By our assumption about truth, that should be equivalent to the lyre sentence itself. So what we have now is an argument from two copies of the lyre sentence to this contradiction, so that is from the liar sentence is not true and the liar sentence is not true, to the conjunction, the liar sentence is true and the liar sentence is not true. Now we appeal again to that contraction principle, that idea that if we've taken two copies of a single premise, we can forget about counting to two and we just need one copy. So now from the liar sentence itself, we have the contradiction. As from the claim that the liar sentence is not true, we have the liar sentence is true and the liar sentence is not true. Now once again apply that truth principle to our premise. So our premise is the liar sentence. We now swap it out for the premise the liar sentence is true. So we've now got an argument from the liar sentence is true to the contradiction. The liar sentence is true and the liar sentence is not true. So far that's exactly paralleled what we did with the Curry to get to if from the Curry sentence is true to 0 equals 1. We now have with the liar from the liar sentence is true to this contradiction. The liar sentence is true and the liar sentence is not true. And we've done it through exactly the same kinds of manipulations. We've swapped around some truth equivalences. We contracted, that is, replaced two occurrences of the same premise with one occurrence of that premise. And the only difference is we replaced modus ponens with this conjunction principle, this principle that let us move from these two sentences to their conjunction. Now, this is the stage in the Curry paradox where we appealed to this other principle that said to establish a conditional, what you do is argue from its antecedent to its consequent. The principle we need here for negation is a principle sometimes called reductio. If you're a fan of distinguishing forms of reductio, this is sometimes called intuitionistic reductio. But where you say, look, what you need to do to establish the negation of a sentence is to argue from the sentence itself to a contradiction. Say, look, and you don't even need the necessary condition claim. All you need is that it suffices to show the negation of a sentence to give an argument from that sentence to a contradiction. So what we've done so far through our liar argument is we've shown that there is this argument from the liar sentence is true to a contradiction. And so using this reductio principle, since there's an argument from the liar sentence is true to a contradiction, we can conclude the liar sentence is not true. As we conclude the negation of the thing that we saw entailed a contradiction. So we've concluded that the liar sentence is not true. Okay, that is, we've concluded the liar sentence. Now, appealing to our truth equivalence, we conclude the liar sentence is true, and what we now have is a demonstration of a contradiction, right? We proved the liar sentence, therefore the liar sentence is true by that truth equivalence. So now actually conjoining them, no longer under supposition, but now just conjoining things we've demonstrated, include the liar sentence is true and the liar sentence is not true. And then if you think contradictions are bad or think nasty things follow from contradictions or want to make some hay with that, then trouble comes from there by whatever form you think trouble comes from a contradiction. But getting to the contradiction out of the liar sentence tracked getting to 0 equals 1 out of the Curry sentence, really step for step. And in fact, I realized as presenting that even going this way I'm going, there's a more efficient way to do it. We can get rid of one of those appeals to the truth early on. But the version I gave you of the liar is parallel to the version I gave you of the Curry, and so tightly parallel that they both even exhibit that same inefficiency. The very same simplification is possible for both of those ways of getting there. And this is what happens over and over again. If you look at any standard way of showing how trouble comes from Curry, there's a really tightly related standard way of showing how trouble comes from the liar, and vice versa. You can rig up ways that work for one but not the other, but those are not the ways that people tend to go to and tend to reach for. The ways that people reach for are getting at something that's pretty deeply in common between the liar and Curry, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, so, the question of how related the liar and Curry is, I guess, itself a fairly controversial one. And I hadn't really, I guess, because the way the arguments are often kind of quickly presented isn't so immediately parallel. I think you doing that parallel derivation was actually very helpful for me to see that point. Now, so let's go back to and we may come back to sort of comparisons with the liar, but let's come back to Curry now. And I guess talk me through a little bit the space of possible solutions, right? I mean, you mentioned 4 sort of principles that we're using. I'm going to guess that the basic space of possible solutions is going to involve rejecting any one of those. But if you could say a bit more about what that sort of map looks like.
Yeah. I mean, I should. It's interesting actually the way I laid it out. The solution that I think is the one I do most of my work on, and the one I'm really quite drawn to and think has important things to say, actually doesn't really naturally appear from that menu that I gave you, that way of breaking it down. So there are definite ways to go that involve rejecting those individual principles along the way, rejecting the truth equivalence, or rejecting modus ponens, or rejecting contraction, that 2-for-1 premise principle, or rejecting the idea that to demonstrate a conditional, it suffices to give a proof of its consequent from its antecedent. All of those are rejectable things, but there are other assumptions being made in structuring that argument that are a little bit less explicit, but are also where you could be casting aspersions and casting questions. So the way I like to sort of break up solutions or taxonomize solutions is into basically three overall camps. And this is rough and ready, and it's controversial whether the lines I'm about to put forward even make sense as ways of understanding solutions. That's just going to be the case for any taxonomy that you give in this area. It'll be controversial whether it makes sense, but I think as a rough and ready way to go, it's not a terrible way to proceed. So one camp that you might think of, but let me do a sort of two-part division actually first off. So the big two-part division in the area, and the one that I think matters a great deal and that we ought to be thinking hard about, and this is because of my sort of meaning-focused orientation to these paradoxes, are the difference between, on the one hand, people who want to address the paradox by tinkering with principles that have something to do with the meaning of particular vocabulary that's involved. Right, so people who want to say, okay, that truth equivalence is no good. The truth doesn't really mean anything that guarantees us this equivalence. Or people who take one of these conditional principles and say something like, oh, modus ponens is no good. The meaning of the conditional doesn't really guarantee that modus ponens is safe for use. Or conditional proof is a name for this other conditional principle I use. That is, if you can prove B from A, then that itself is a proof of if A then B. Call that conditional proof. Modus ponens and conditional proof have both been held up as part of the meaning of the conditional. But some people because of worries about the Curry paradox, or sometimes for other reasons, but at the moment we're focused on the Curry paradox, right? We'll address Curry paradox by saying, okay, the conditional doesn't really obey those principles. So you can think of these as sort of vocabulary-focused approaches that say the steps that went wrong were these steps that seem to have to do with the meaning of some of the words in there. Maybe truth, maybe the conditional, maybe if someone wanted to mess around with self-reference and say something like, okay, that sentence looks like it refers to itself, but it can't really refer to itself because if it did, we'd have this paradox, and we don't have this paradox. Right, then it looks like they're going to be messing with the meaning of either the demonstrative that's in the sentence, if you have a demonstrative formulation, if this sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. Or maybe they'll be messing with the meaning of a proper name if we just try to dub that sentence, Curry, and say, then if Curry is true, then 0 equals 1. So I want to put all those solutions on kind of one side and say what they're doing is they're taking the Curry paradox to show us something non-obvious about the meanings of the vocabulary involved. Right? Maybe it's something non-obvious about truth or about the conditional or about the devices involved in self-reference, but the theories that people sort of came up with when they weren't worried about the paradoxes for these various vocabulary items, these sort of vocabulary-focused theories are going to say, okay, those theories can't all be right. Something's got to give over there. That's the first family. Then there's a second family I think is worth thinking about. And this is the family that actually holds to all of those vocabulary principles, that says, okay, actually the vocabulary's worked out just fine. The sort of modus ponens conditional proof story about the conditional, no problem. Equivalence for the truth predicate, no problem. that a sentence can refer to itself in this way, no problem, and that locate the problem somewhere else. And there's a range of different other places you might locate the problem, but these are all going to have to do with essentially the structure of the reasoning that's going on in that sort of case. So if you look at the reasoning that I gave, you can see, for example, there was this explicit appeal to contraction along the way in the middle of it. This idea that if we have a good argument with two copies of the same premise, then we would have a good argument if we only had one copy of that same premise. That's not a principle that's about any particular vocabulary. That's not a principle that's part of the meaning of if or of true or of any of the stuff involved in the Curry sentence. That's a principle about the structure of the reasoning involved. And there are other natural assumptions that we're making along the way in that reasoning about what sorts of patterns or structures it's okay to shape our reasoning into. And solutions or approaches to Curry paradox or to other paradoxes that work over here, among their advantages are they can give the sort of straightforward and obvious theories of what that vocabulary all means. The costs, of course, are they're going to take these manipulations, these structure of reasoning that we often take for granted and say, okay, that's where the problem is. The sorts of reasoning structures we go through all the time, it's not actually safe to take those for granted. Some of those can go wrong in various ways. And so this is where I would locate what are called substructural solutions. And they're called substructural solutions because they allow us less than what we might have assumed are safe structural manipulations of what's going on. And so one of the sort of best studied variants of these substructural solutions, I mean, it itself has a lot of variants within it, but it's a sort of subfamily of substructural solutions, would be one that attacks exactly that assumption of contraction and says that's what needs to go. Contraction was the problem along the way. That would be an example of a substructural kind of approach. So this is this taxonomy that I'm offering between vocabulary-based and structural-based approaches is definitely a different taxonomy from one that's commonly offered. And so there's a very commonly offered taxonomy of approaches to paradoxes that splits them into classical and non-classical, where the classicality in question is classical logic, and classical logic it's I don't actually know where classical logic got its name, but anyway, it's more classical like classical music than it is like classical architecture. It's a 19th century sort of thing. It's not old. But I think thinking of these things as classical versus non-classical misses some important commonalities. So one thing that happens, right, is people say, oh, classical theories of truth. They have to modify this truth equivalent stuff. They've got to say that the claim that something is true can't be equivalent to that thing itself. Contentious whether that's so, because it's contentious what it takes to be classical. But regardless, it looks to me like, okay, if you're going to tinker with your theory of truth, that's not all that different from tinkering with your theory of the conditional. Like either way, we're just focusing on meanings of particular vocabulary items. And indeed, a lot of the arguments that so-called non-classical theorists give against so-called classical theorists center around things like, but that's just not what truth means. Whereas vice versa, some of the things that classical theorists will give as arguments against the kind of so-called non-classical theorist who would give a different theory of a conditional, who would say, for example, like J.C. Beale has recently been going around pushing and say, okay, look, the conditional doesn't satisfy modus ponens, and that's where the problem is in this sort of reasoning. And your standard classical theorist is going to say, well, look, if it doesn't have modus ponens, then that's just not what the conditional means. So the arguments that get thrown back and forth between classical and non-classical theorists and theories, at least those that live over on the vocabulary side of the divide, look like really parallel arguments, at least to me, right? Some of them are holding their theory of truth fixed in a way that they're allowing to shove around their theory of conditionals. Some of them are holding their theory of conditionals fixed in a way that they're allowing to shove around their theory of truth. But it's sort of an argument over which piece of vocabulary do we try to let the pressure off in. And so, although a lot of the literature understands those approaches to be kind of fundamentally opposed, to me something seems really kind of a piece about them. And where my work is largely focused, but a lot of other people's work as well, is on approaches that say, okay, what if we just kind of hold all of that vocabulary fixed and then let the pressure off somewhere else, let the pressure off in the structure of this argumentation. So I'm quite interested in these substructural approaches and in seeing what they have to offer. And so to me, it makes more sense to divide up views this way, rather than along a classical, non-classical divide, which I think, one, makes substructural views kind of harder to see, but two, also gives the distinction between tinkering with truth and tinkering with the conditional more importance than I think it probably has.
I kind of want to make a comment about what you just said, and then hear what you think about it.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like part of what is going on, and some of what you just described, is that when people are doing logic, whatever it'd be, classical logic or non-classical logic, whatever, what they're working with. Let's focus on the connectives. So the conditional and or not, right, are sort of formal versions of words that we have ready access to, that we use all the time. And so the logic is very tied, or it seems like it should be very tied, to our use of these words. And so at that level, there is a very strong connection between simply the meaning of familiar words like and, or, etc., and these logical systems that we're kind of constructing. Versus when you go to the substructural level, it seems like there isn't the same analog there. There aren't like these sort of, I don't know, let's just say words that you're kind of beholden to, in the way where in the classical logic, let's say, you are, just because it seems like the words are just so familiar.
Yeah. I mean, I think I largely agree with that thrust. I think it's worth being a little bit careful about, even at a broad level of approximation, already worth being careful about connecting the kinds of connectives that we often study in logical tools too directly to natural language words. They're clearly in some sense inspired by natural language words, and they bear some kind of connection, but these can be more or less direct. So depending on, and in particular, a notorious problem case for understanding natural language words in terms of the kinds of connectives we study in logic, one of the notorious problem cases is precisely if. That is, conditional constructions. If then are there are a lot of differences between conditional constructions as they seem to occur in natural language on the one hand, and as you would see them in a textbook on classical logic on the other, but also a lot of non-classical logics exhibit a range of the same kinds of differences from natural language that classical logic does when it comes to thinking about something like if. So there's some kind of indirectness there. One way of this is, I think, one reason to think about Curry paradox, if you're concerned with the natural language version of the Curry paradox, in terms of these things like modus ponens and something like conditional proof, which do actually, I think, seem plausible enough as ways of understanding something like natural language conditionals. The details, particularly around conditional proof, are going to get messy. But I don't think we're completely out in left field here anyway, in the way that if you take the material conditional classical logic and you try to understand natural language conditionals with that, I think you're going to end up out in left field pretty quick. It doesn't look like it looks like that the material conditional classical logic validates a whole heck of a lot of things that natural language conditionals at least don't seem to. But I think the sort of paradoxical trouble arises from more minimal kinds of behavior.
Now I want to get to the substructural solutions, but and so I want to ask you to first say something about the other family of solutions that you mentioned. But I don't want to get to too much detail because I do want to get to the substructural stuff. I wonder if you could say, besides what you already said, which is sort of, you're hesitant to kind of tinker with the vocabulary, what your sort of reasons are for not being as interested or as hopeful in that sort of family of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's something of an attitude with which those solutions are often explored, a spirit in which those solutions are often explored. And I'm going to point to the spirit, but I don't think it's like just happens to be a personality quirk of the people who end up doing those. I mean, I think there's something to this. I think the spirit is sort of tracking something about what's happening over there. And there's a bit of a sense of defeat. There's a bit of a sense of like, oh, we can't have everything we want. It sure looks like things work this way, but now we have this derivation and it shows us that they can't. So, okay, well, what are we more attached to? Do we like conditionals better or do we like truth better? And if you like conditionals better, you tinker with your theory of truth. If you like truth better, you tinker with your theory of conditionals. That's not, I mean, sometimes people frame that up as an argument. And as an argument, it's an argument that I've tried to argue against. But I think it's often a spirit with which that sort of work is engaged in. And I think you often see, not exclusively, but you do often see arguments over in that literature of like, okay, well, why do you have this theory of truth that seems at first blush completely implausible? And the response really is, well, the paradoxes blew up my other theory, which looked better. Or why do you have this theory of the conditional, which seems at first blush completely implausible? Well, the paradoxes blew up my other theory of the conditional, which worked better, right? There's this sort of sense of resignation over there, which is, as I say, I think it's tracking something about how you end up believing those views, right? Is you do just find you feel defeated. Whereas I tend to see these sort of substructural approaches as going like, wait a minute, maybe we're not out of it yet. Maybe we can sort of give, at least for someone like me who's motivated by trying to give theories a meaning in the first place, well, maybe all those motivations, wanting to say that truth gives us this kind of equivalence and conditionals give us this sort of behavior and negations give us that sort of behavior and whatever you like, maybe there isn't actually any problem with those theories. It looked like the paradoxes threatened those theories, but it was really only the paradoxes together with these problematic assumptions about what sorts of structural manipulations we were able to appeal to. Now, to see this as an optimistic response, you've got to, you could give the same kind of argument for this, right? And say like, oh, we've got to give up this structural thing. Oh, I've been defeated. Oh, I've been shoved over here. You absolutely could do that. And I don't think that sort of justification is absent. But there's another way to proceed where you say, well, wait a minute, whatever made us take these structural things seriously in the first place? Right? Not any theories of meaning, not any particular vocabulary or anything like that. And so where I have tried to shift my own motivation in terms of thinking about these structural things is essentially into the meta-semantics, in thinking what is it that we want our theory of meaning to tell us, what features of a language should we expect our theory of meaning to be based in and to track and to capture. And I think if you start from there and just sort of step carefully forwards, and I don't actually mean carefully in the sense of like having an eye on dodging the paradoxes, but I mean carefully just in the sense of thinking about what you can actually justify from thinking about the kinds of linguistic behavior that we ought to be tracking on our way to a theory of meaning. I think it turns out that some of the crucial structural manipulations just aren't justified in the first place. There's no reason ever to accept them. And that's independent of the fact that they would give rise to the paradoxes if you did. They're just not motivated. And if you think that, then it looks like over on the substructural side, there is the availability of a kind of have-it-all solution. A sort of optimistic kind of outcome. So when I think about my actual real motivations for liking these substructural things, they're largely just because, I think it'd be nice if we could actually get this stuff more or less sorted out. And I think that's kind of how you end up, or it's one way to end up over on the substructural side, because it doesn't look like there's going to be much sorting out on the vocabulary side. There's rather just going to be accepting various kinds of defeat and then quibbling over which kind of defeat to accept.
Yeah. Great. So I should say I'm, as I imagine most people listening, I'm fairly new to substructural logic. And the sort of the pitch you just gave is really exciting because for sure, my experience going through sort of the various different solutions to the various paradoxes is so often just like, I can't accept any of this. You know, like that's just not what this means. What are you doing?
Yep.
Yeah, so your pitch is certainly exciting. So let's dig into that a little bit. First, could you say a bit more about what exactly, you already more or less said this, but say a bit more about what are substructural, what are like the structural rules you were talking about? What makes them that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of different, depending on how you sort of set up the formalization of the argument and exactly, and in particular, there's lots and lots of stickiness, which I don't know how much we want to get near over the exact formulation of modus ponens that plays a role in the argument. So I used a particular form in the earlier presentation, which was supposing that the argument with two premises and one conclusion is valid, where the two premises are a conditional on the one hand, and its antecedent is the other premise, and then its conclusion is its consequent. You might prefer other forms of modus ponens, and some substructuralists do, but assuming that form of modus ponens, there's sort of two main options that have been looked at, or two main families that it's very much not exhaustive, and there's other work going on that doesn't fit into either of these families. But the two main ones that have been looked at in this regard are, on the one hand, the non-contractive approach, and this is sort of the one I've been flagging. This is, I think, probably the best developed sort of family of substructural approaches to these paradoxes. Is this non-contractive approach, where what you're doing is resisting this idea. If I have a valid argument with two occurrences of the same premise, that doesn't mean that I would have a valid argument if I just had one occurrence of that premise. So what a non-contractive approach has to do is say, validity in the sense that we care about, validity in the sense that we're tracking through this problem, is something that is sensitive to how many times a premise gets used. If we need to appeal to something twice, that's different from just appealing to it once. And so if we know, okay, I could appeal to this premise twice and get my conclusion, it doesn't follow from that I could appeal to it once and get my conclusion. And frankly, I think if you're thinking about substructural solutions and their sort of formal interest and intrigue, I really think some of the most beautiful work is over in this family. There's really, really cool stuff going on in this family. The reason that I myself don't primarily work in non-contractive approaches, although I try to consider myself part of the sort of loyal opposition to non-contractive approaches, I think there's something beautiful and there's something really excellent about these approaches, even though I spend much of my time arguing against them. The real problem, as I see it, is I have difficulty finding a notion of validity that I think is appropriately connected to meaning in natural language on the one hand, that is sensitive to number of uses on the other. So it looks like the non-contractivist needs some kind of approach that's sensitive to number of uses. Yeah, and they give various theories of what validity might amount to, sometimes involving extraction of information from things, sometimes involving sort of more directly metaphysical approach, where these are sort of unstable states of affairs. And if you have a premise twice, you're sort of holding the state of affairs stable, whereas if you have it once, it might kind of slip out of the way when you try to appeal to it. Other views that say, no, validity is just a primitive and this is just how it works. But all these range of views, I have difficulty seeing how to wire them up, how to connect them to a theory of meaning. So they might be perfectly good theories of validity. They give you this non-contractive behavior. That non-contractive behavior does, in fact, suffice to block the paradoxes. But I'm just not. The reason I don't love these approaches for my own sort of work is that trying to get this notion of validity that's interpretable in a way that matters for meaning, but also interpretable in a way where we can see it makes sense to be counting numbers of occurrences of the premises. So that's one main family of these sorts of things. The other main family of substructural approaches, and this is the sort of thing I spend a lot of my time arguing for, is what's sometimes called a non-transitive approach. Using the word transitivity as applied to consequence relations is a little bit tricky. But in general, you want to think of transitivity as involving at least something like the following. If we've got a valid argument from A to B, and we've got a valid argument from B to C, then we can link them together and get a valid argument from A to C. Right? So you go from premise to conclusion, then you take that conclusion as a premise and go to another conclusion, and then you count yourself as having made it to your final conclusion from your first premise. So that didn't explicitly feature in the version of Curry paradox that I walked you through before. I didn't point that out or appeal to it directly. Where I was actually appealing to it was at the very, very end of the argument. So went through the reasoning, get out a proof of the Curry sentence, proof of if the Curry sentence is true, then 0 equals 1. And then together we say, okay, by applying the truth principle, we conclude the Curry sentence is true. And then that very final thing, that what I called it was an application of modus ponens. Right, we went from having demonstrated the Curry sentence and having demonstrated that the Curry sentence is true to the idea that we have then demonstrated 0 equals 1, the consequent of the Curry sentence. I called that an application of modus ponens. But depending on what you mean by modus ponens, it may or may not be. And in particular, if you mean by modus ponens the thing that I had earlier called modus ponens, which is an argument that has as premises the Curry sentence and the claim that the Curry sentence is true, then this step at the end isn't an application of modus ponens, because it starts out with the Curry sentence as a conclusion, and with the idea that the Curry sentence is true as a conclusion. We've concluded these from that earlier kind of reasoning. But what we're doing here in trying to apply modus ponens is trying to draw on them as premises. In other words, we're linking two arguments together exactly here. On the one hand, the sort of Curry-ish argument that got us the proof of the conditional, and on the other hand, modus ponens, trying to link those arguments together, taking the Curry conditional as a conclusion of the first argument and as a premise in the next one. And that linking is where I think that argument plausibly goes wrong. Now, as I said earlier, one of the reasons I'm spend time arguing against non-contractive approaches is I don't see a notion of validity appropriately tied to use in natural language that enables us to count occurrences like that. So I very much do hold myself accountable to try to be able to give a notion of validity that is tied to our uses in natural language that can explain why we might have failures of transitivity like this, how we might have a valid argument from A to B and a valid argument from B to C without having a valid argument from A to C. But in this case, when it comes to non-transitive things, I think it's really straightforward to do that, actually. I think the appropriate notion of validity is one that's been sort of made popular in the last 15 years or so by Greg Restall. I think you see it much more broadly. It's in Strawson's Introduction to Logic book from the 50s. This is Strawson's notion of validity that he takes up there, and it's been developed in a range of other places. But the core idea here is you understand validity as in some sense a ruling out of asserting all your premises together with denying your conclusion, or if you have multiple conclusions, denying all your conclusions. And you say an argument is valid in the sense that we care about when these sorts of combinations of speech acts are ruled out, the combination of asserting all the premises and denying the conclusion. So to say that modus ponens is valid in this sense is to rule out asserting a conditional together with asserting its antecedent together with denying its consequent. If you think of validity this way, then there's actually no reason, I don't think, to accept that that particular relation is transitive, to accept that it connects together like this. Because what transitivity would amount to in that case would be to say, basically, so you think A entails B, so we've ruled out asserting A and denying B. B entails C, so we've ruled out asserting B and denying C. Well, does that rule out asserting A and denying C? No, it doesn't. It rules out asserting A and denying C if we go on, in addition to assert B, because asserting B and denying C has been ruled out. And it rules out asserting A and denying C if we go on to, in addition, deny B, because asserting A and denying B has been ruled out. But if we just assert A and deny C and we remain silent on B, nothing has ruled that out at all. So I think if you think about this potential notion of validity, and again, I'm not offering this as an analysis of logical validity or anything like that. I don't have any views about logical validity. I do think this notion of ruling out certain collections of speech acts is an important one for understanding natural language meaning. And I think if you take up that notion, you can see that that transitivity in the form I've given you, but also in a number of related forms. We just have no reason to expect that it would hold. And if we have no reason to expect that it would hold, then it's nice when it turns out that that solves the paradoxes all on its own, that you can sort of keep all the other sort of steps you might have wanted around. So those, I think, are and there are other ways of developing non-transitive views as well, but that's the particular way of doing it that I favor, because I think it's the one that connects most directly to our genuine use of language, to the assertions and denials that we actually make, and to the way those contribute to the meanings of our words. And there are, as I say, other substructural approaches around. There are substructural approaches that turn on denying reflexivity, denying that it's the case that everything entails itself. And these will they'll need to be careful about modus ponens as well, but in a slightly different way. They'll end up actually rejecting the form of modus ponens that I've been talking about, but accepting a different form, and so on. So a lot of the difficulty around substructural approaches to Curry paradox comes with worry about various forms of modus ponens. But the form of modus ponens that I've been drawing on and that I take to be the basic one, which is just a valid argument with two premises and a conclusion, where the premises are a conditional and its antecedent and the conclusion is its consequent, that's one that's typically accepted as valid by both non-contractive and non-transitive theories alike. Although, as I said, there's a lot of other forms and some need for care. But that's a way to do the sort of basic breakdown of these substructural approaches.
I want to ask you a bit about your sort of explanation or your tying of the of denying transitivity with a kind of, a natural explanation of validity. Because the first thing I want to ask is, so you gave this account of validity, which is you're simply ruling out the possibility of accepting or asserting the two premises or however many premises you have, and denying the conclusion. So now, let's stick to this case where we only have one argument. There's no sort of linking yet. If you have this kind of valid argument, are you not sort of, at this point, do you now have a kind of right to assert the conclusion, or merely are you sort of not allowed to deny it?
Definitely just merely not allowed to deny it. So the where you end up, I think, when you deal with these paradoxical sentences, is you actually end up in a kind of double bind, where if you were to assert, say, the Curry sentence, you would be violating one of these obligations that you have in virtue of the meanings of the words involved. But also, if you were to deny it, you would be violating these obligations that you have in virtue of the meanings involved. Right? We've got a proof of the thing. So if you deny it, you're denying something you've got a proof of. Don't do that. On the other hand, we've got a proof from the thing to 0 equals 1. And you surely want to be able to deny that 0 equals 1. So you'd better not assert the thing either, because then that would rule out denying that 0 equals 1. So I think where you end up with, and the liar sentence, I think, is similar in this regard, and other sort of paradoxes. And where I think you end up with these is constrained by the meanings of the words involved in these paradoxes into something like this double bind, where you shouldn't assert it and you shouldn't deny it. So it definitely does not follow on my picture from the fact that denying something is ruled out, that it's okay to assert it. And in fact, the claim that when denials are ruled out, assertions are okay, or equivalently, the claim that when assertions are ruled out, denials are okay, that claim turns out basically equivalent to the claim of transitivity, to the claim that you can link these things together in certain kinds of ways. There's details here about exactly exactly how to formulate it. But essentially that idea that we can't ever be in a double bind, some way of going on is always open to us, no matter what we're talking about, no matter how paradoxical it gets. That kind of principle is a principle that I'm definitely rejecting. And if I were to accept it, that would bring back the kind of transitivity for this constraining relation that I'm interested in. That would mean the paradoxes would actually cause some real trouble. So that's you've got your finger right on what I think is a pretty central point.
So I kind of want to say something similar to what you have said about the sort of the other broad family of solutions, which is roughly something like you're messing with the meaning of validity, right? Like, and of course, validity is already a more technical notion than like if then or what have you, right? But I still think there's something to validity, and you can challenge me on that if you want. But the idea, it seems to me, is like the version of validity that you're now giving me seems just weaker than what I kind of expect from validity, right? I expect validity to like give me a conclusion. Aha, now I can use it, right? So long as I've got those premises, like now I can do what, I can say this thing. And you're saying, nope, you can't go that far. It's weaker than that. So how do you justify that bridge if you accept that there is such a thing?
Yeah, I remember it's just no part of my project to capture any ideas about what logic is or anything like that. I'm happy to call this thing schmalidity if you like. Right, I'm not trying to get at any sort of pre-theoretic picture of validity or what validity is good for or anything. I rather think that these constraints on collections of assertions and denials are exactly what we need to be looking at in order to give good theories of the meanings of our words. I think when we're trying to offer these theories of meaning, the way to do it is in terms of thinking of assertion conditions and denial conditions. And the kinds of conditions we should be thinking about are conditions under which these collections of them all do and don't fit together. So the conditions under which an assertion fits together with some other collection of acts, or conditions on which a denial fits together with some other collections of acts. Those assertion and denial conditions, I think, are where we ought to be, how we ought to understand our semantic theories. What our semantic theories are telling us is they're giving us these pictures of assertion and denial conditions. And so this is the view in metasemantics. It's a view about what we're trying to do with our semantics, or what we ought to be trying to do with our semantics. I think that's the right way to understand giving a theory of meaning for a language. Now, that's a way of saying it that doesn't anywhere use the word validity, right? That's just what sorts of relations should we be caring about when we're exploring our language. But now you might say, okay, well, if those are the relations we care about, what actually do they behave like, right? Now you might engage in some semantics, not just metasemantics, but some semantics, and start giving theories of the meanings of various pieces of vocabulary in terms of how they interact with these assertion and denial conditions. And I think one thing that kind of leaps out when you proceed that way, and this is something that I've found very inspiring in Restel's work on this kind of stuff, although he's a little cagier than I am about trying to found a whole theory of meaning for all of natural language on this. He is talking about logic in a way that I'm not. But one thing I found very inspiring in his work, and have really tried to draw on there, is that if you start say, okay, well, what kind of theory of negation do we want, say, in these terms? Plausible theory of negation is that you can deny a negation in those conditions where you can assert the negatum, and that you can assert the negation in those conditions where you deny the negatum, for example. But if you render that, if you just write that down with this relation in the middle, you're looking at what are essentially Gens and sequent calculus rules for negation. Similarly, plausible theory of a conjunction. You can assert a conjunction in those circumstances where you can assert both conjuncts together. You can deny a conjunction, and remember here, I mean something like deny it coherently, not you have warrant to deny it, but rather, if you were to deny it, it wouldn't clash with other things you've done. Just in those circumstances where you can deny one conjunct or you can deny the other. And again, if you write those down, you're looking at what are essentially Gens and sequent rules for conjunction. So if you start asking after this relation of constraints on assertion and denial, when you start writing down plausible rules for various sorts of vocabulary, what you find yourself writing down, I think, are basically rules that govern classical logic and that have been known to govern classical logic for a long time. And so when you see that pattern arise, I think now it becomes worth asking, okay, can we draw on the tools of logic? Can we draw on what logicians have learned and developed and spend all this time working on to understand this relation of constraint that's central for, or at least that I think is central for understanding the semantics of natural language. And so I'm very happy to pillage logicians' tools. I'm absolutely rummaging through their work and toolkits. And where they're saying things like validity, what I'm interpreting that as is this relation of constraint, because that's how their tools end up applying to the kinds of things that I'm concerned with exploring. But I'm definitely not offering any kind of theory of validity here. And in fact, you've got, within this theory of constraint, you've got an available question that you could ask. So look, this notion of constraint, right? You can't assert the premises and deny the conclusion. That doesn't give you any guarantee that you can safely assert the conclusion when it obtains, even if you have safely asserted the premises. But what about if we ask after another relation? Okay, we don't care about this one that Dave wants to think about. Let's ask about this other relation. In terms of those same constraints on assertion and denial, whatever they are, well, what's the relation such that if I've asserted the premises and it was safe to do so, then I have a guarantee that it's safe to assert the conclusion as well? You can ask that question, and you get an answer. It looks something like a strong Kleene theory. You could similarly ask us a similar kind of question about denial, right? What if I've safely denied the conclusion? What do I know about when I can safely deny the premises as well? You get an answer to that. It looks like LP, right? So there are connections here to various sort of well-studied non-classical theories. But those sorts of relations, if you come at them from this perspective, part of the reason you shouldn't, well, I mean, you can ask those questions because you should ask every question. That's lovely. But part of the reason you shouldn't try to found your theory of meaning on those questions, and you should try to found it on the question that I am asking, which is about constraints that take both assertion and denial into account, is to get a theory of negation that's compositional in the right kind of way. So if you look at various proof theories for strong Kleene logic or for LP or so on, what you see is that you can't predict the inferential behavior of a negation in terms of the inferential behavior of the thing negated. And so these proof theories have to do special roundabout things to handle negation. Whereas if you take the sorts of systems that I'm more interested in, where we're asking simultaneously about assertion and denial, we're not trying to reduce either to the other, but just asking both questions at once, then I think you can get nice and straightforward and compositional theories of negation. So I wouldn't want to rule out the kinds of questions that you're asking and that it sounds like you might think bear a closer connection to what you'd call validity. I think those are fine questions. I think those are great. And they're probably at least potentially related to the kinds of questions I'm asking in some sort of way. But not by being the same questions, just by constraining each other in these more indirect ways.
Okay. So what about the actual assertability conditions and denial conditions, right? So moving away from the concept from concept of validity, which, as I said, is already from the beginning a kind of technical question. There does seem to be, I guess, let's just say, an intuition that says that, that assertability and deniability are kind of mirrors of each other, and when you have, where you have one, you have the sort of reverse of the other. And so, what is the story here for why that's not necessarily the case? Why it's why we may have cases where you can assert and yet not deny, or vice versa.
Yeah, and essentially these cases, I think, are coming to us from the paradoxes, right? I mean, it's that experience that I think is familiar when thinking through the paradoxes of, oh boy, it looks like this is undeniable, but it also looks like if I assert it, I'm going to run into trouble, is an appearance that I think is basically veridical. And it's an appearance of exactly this kind of double line. And you see it not just in cases like the liar and the Curry paradox, but also, I think in the case of the Sorites paradox, right? If you imagine someone walking you down a Sorites paradox and saying, okay, is this thing red? Is this thing red? Is this thing red? Is this thing red as you go? there's that sense at some point of like, well, I said the last thing's red, so I'd better not deny that this one is. But I don't want to assert that this one is either, because I see where this is going. I'm going to run into trouble, and and if I've been pushed down the line far enough, then I just don't want to assert that this is red because I can see what color it is. And so this sense of double bind, this sense of being trapped, this sense of neither being able to deny the thing that you want to deny, nor being able to assert the thing that you want to assert, and even when those are the very same thing, of neither being able to assert nor deny the same thing, I almost take as part of the phenomenon to be explained. It's kind of part of what we run into when we feel the force of these paradoxes. And so rather than deny the force of the paradoxes or say that's an illusion or say here's what you do, just assert it, or here's what you do, just deny it, or something like that. What I'm interested in doing is as I say, one, sort of holding to the theories of the meaning involved that are what I think generates that feeling in the first place. And then two, simply seeing what follows from them. What situation are we actually in when we get there?
So I'm having a familiar sense of the sense. Well, this essentially looks to me like a gap, a different kind of gap than the gap we're sort of used to when we're dealing with, the gappy approaches to the paradoxes. But it does seem to me like we have this usually binary situation with assertability and deniability, and yet here there's this sort of like, there are these cases where, there's almost like you have to just be silent. You can't go either way. And now, I first of all want to just sort of make that broad observation about noticing a kind of gap and give you an opportunity to complicate it. But also wanted to ask, one thing I'm familiar with the sort of gappy approaches to paradoxes is that they're open to the revenge versions. And I'm curious whether whether there are similar kind of revenge problems that have popped up as you've worked on the substructural approach.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're right to see some kind of connection to gappy approaches here. But I would want to resist at least the implication that the connection to gappy approaches is any stronger than the connection to glutty approaches is. I actually think the view I'm putting forward is basically symmetrically poised between them. So definitely connected to both. But if you look at a sort of gappy approach, someone who wants to, deny the Curry sentence and also deny its negation, and also they won't assert it and they won't assert its negation. Well, I'm going to be like someone like that in my assertion behavior. I don't want to assert it and I don't want to assert its negation. But I'm going to be very unlike them in my denial behavior because I don't want to deny it and I don't want to deny its negation either. Right? I definitely don't want to deny it because I got a proof of it. And I also don't want to deny its negation for a similar reason, right? There's, you can, it takes a little bit longer, but you can drag it out. But now we're looking at interactions between negation and conditionals and whatnot. But basically the same reason. So if you look at assertion behavior only, what I'm advocating looks a lot like a gappy view. But it's a key part of what I'm putting forward, that assertion behavior and denial behavior are separate and need to be treated separately. And when you look at denial behavior, it doesn't look anything like a gappy view. On the other hand, if you look at someone who wants to, say, assert the Curry sentence together with its negation, right, a sort of glutty view, they don't want to deny it and they don't want to deny its negation. They want to assert them both. Well, I'm like them in my denial. Right? I don't want to deny it. I don't want to deny its negation. But I'm not like them in assertion. Right? I don't want to assert it either, and I don't want to assert its negation either. And so the relationship that the kind of view I'm putting forward bears to gappy views is really the exact same relationship that it bears to glutty views, just turned on its head or turned upside down. So it's definitely got affinities to both of them, and you're absolutely right to see those affinities to both of them. But I don't see that the affinities break one way or the other. And there's some literature on this view that people have been pushing that argue that it's effectively more like a glutty view than it is like a gappy view, and I tend to think that literature is off track for essentially the same reason, right? I really do see it as symmetrically poised between a gappy view and a glutty view, bearing these relations to both, but not being identical to either. That said, to turn to the revenge part of what you're thinking about, there's a bunch of different ways to think about where revenge might threaten. Where it seems to me that revenge is most likely to threaten is not in terms of anything involving a truth predicate or strong truth or anything of that sort, because the sort of theory that I'm giving is starting from thinking about these bounds on collections of assertions and denials. And so, in fact, while I want to give a theory of what truth means, and that theory is essentially just this equivalence view of truth, I'm not actually giving my theory ever using the word truth. The word truth is a word that I only mention. It's a word I want to tell you about the meaning of, so I'll tell you about the meaning of it. But it's not playing any sort of foundational role in either the metasemantics or the semantics that I want to give. So if there's going to be a revenge problem, it's not going to be one that comes up in terms of truth, because truth just isn't playing that kind of crucial theoretical role. I think the most likely place to see a revenge problem, if this sort of view were to run into one, would be by trying to bring into the language itself these discussions about which collections of assertions and denials are ruled out, because that is playing this crucial theoretical role. That's the sort of foundational principle. So you might think things, for example, like, if I make a bunch of assertions and then I also assert that asserting that bunch of assertions together with denying something else is ruled out, then if I also go on to deny that other thing, then that whole package of things I've done is ruled out. You might think something like that. I've got my quibbles, but let's assume that's true, right, as a question, because what we're asking now is about assertion and denial conditions for the claim that certain collections of assertions and denials are ruled out. And so this is one possible story you could give of its assertion conditions, right? If I make a bunch of assertions and I make a bunch of denials, and then I say that what I just did is ruled out, then that whole collection of things really is ruled out. That's a thing you might think. On the other hand, you might also think, so that tells you something about assertion conditions for this ruled out claim. You might also ask about, okay, but under what conditions can I deny this ruled out claim? You might say, well, here's at least something. If asserting a bunch of things and denying a bunch of other things really is ruled out, then it's ruled out to deny that asserting those things and denying those things is ruled out. In other words, if you can't go around denying that things are ruled out if they actually are ruled out. Your denials about ruling out have to get it right. I've got quarrels with both of these principles about bringing ruled out into the language, but we can set them aside. Suppose that ruling out obeyed these sorts of principles. These are principles that are well known in literature on so-called validity curry. Because this ruled out predicate is playing the role for me that the validity predicate will typically play in thinking about validity curry. And these are principles like the principle sometimes called validity detachment, the modus ponens-like thing was the first one. And like validity proof, the conditional proof-like thing was the second one. And these are used in arguments that various views face revenge paradoxes, exactly around their notion of validity. And I think if the view that I was putting forward were to face a revenge paradox, it would face a revenge paradox right here. Sometimes people try to frame it in terms of paradoxes involving assertability and deniability or whatnot, but that's all captured right here, right? Assertability is, it's not ruled out to assert. So if we can capture this predicate that talks about which collections are ruled out and which collections aren't, then an assertability predicate, a deniability predicate, and so on are all definable from this thing. And what you see if you add those principles or principles like them into a sort of formal regimentation of this sort of thing is, well, one, the thing certainly doesn't blow up on you, right? You can form all the sort of paradoxical sentences you want, and you're not going to get You're not going to be able to derive that 0 equals 1. You're not going to be able to derive that pigs fly. You're not going to be able to derive any of that sort of stuff. So you might worry about paradoxical sentences like, so a typical validity curry sentence would say something like, the argument from this sentence to 0 equals 1 is a valid argument. Similarly, in this setting, you might imagine a sentence that says, asserting this very sentence together with denying that 0 equals 1 is ruled out. That would be the sort of analogous kind of V curry sentence. And what there isn't is any demonstration of 0 equals 1 or anything like that. And the reason why not is exactly the same reason you'd expect. Well, what you shouldn't do with a sentence like that is assert it, and you also shouldn't deny it. Right? It comes out looking exactly like a curry sentence. Whether that suffices to show revenge immunity or not, I think there's reasonable disagreement over. So I'm pretty happy with that. I don't think it's an awful sort of situation to end up in. But you do end up, and this is connected to some work that Eduardo Barrio and Lucas Rosenblatt and Diego Tahir have done. You do get out of this some things that you might think you'd want to deny turn out to be undeniable. You shouldn't assert them, right? And there's no problem in that sense. But you might think, I would really like to deny that thing. And these are things that are a bit. So, for example, you shouldn't deny. So consider that first sentence, right? The if this argument is valid, then 0 equals 1. I'm sorry, that was a terrible thing. Erase that sentence. Consider this sentence that says you shouldn't assert me and deny that 0 equals 1. Together, I'm going to need a name for that sentence. Call it Steve. So you end up being unable to deny that if the argument from 0 equals 0 to Steve is valid and the argument from Steve to 0 equals 1 is valid, then the argument from 0 equals 0 to 0 equals 1 is valid. That is, you end up, when you try to talk about transitivity, about linking together in the language itself, you end up unable to deny that this instance of transitivity preserves validity. Whereas in some sense, sort of standing back externally, that's one of the instances of transitivity that absolutely has to fail in order to preserve validity. So although you don't get sort of horrifying consequences like 0 equals 1 itself, or like pigs fly itself, coming out of internalizing these constraints into the language in this kind of way, you do get conclusions you might or might not want. I've got stories to spin about that, but look, at the end of the day, it is a spin job. Like, that conclusion does follow, and follow in a sense that makes it undeniable, where there's at least some impulse to think that it sure would be nice to deny that.
Okay, all right. I've got one more question for you. Not really about Curry specifically, but more actually about your work on substructural logic. And so, yeah, and it's actually just a broad question of, I guess, aside from what we've been talking about, what are sort of pressing issues in that area, and where do you see sort of exciting and important work to be done in developing these theories?
Boy, all over the place. Substructural logic it's sort of interesting historically. It was, I suppose this happens to lots of things, but it was sort of rolling along for a while and in a number of different areas in different ways before it became self-conscious. So there's a number of different kind of tributaries coming into substructural logic, and there's a sort of blending of traditions that happens within substructural logic. So my own path into substructural logic, and this is one of the traditions that's very much kind of flowing into substructural logic, comes from the relevant logic tradition, particularly the sort of US-Australia axis, and in my case, given accidents of my training, particularly the Australian wing of the US-Australian axis, which is exploring sort of these very weak relevant logics that turn out to be and largely pursuing them in these contexts of axiomatic systems, where it becomes actually quite difficult to think about structural rules like contraction or something like that as structural rules. If you write axiomatic systems, you've just got, here's this principle, here's this principle, here's this principle, the other things follow, and so on. But as that tradition went on, they developed different kinds of proof systems as well as different kinds of various model theories and algebraic model theories that turned out to be strongly connected to other kinds of substructural logics. But if you think about something like the linear logic tradition coming out of Europe, right, again, stumbled into very similar sorts of areas with different motivations going on in the background. There's various sorts of algebraic traditions that have been studying a bunch of these structures in their own right and so on. So there's a bunch of different sources of substructural logic that have sort of flown together and are now kind of understood as having something to say to each other and talking to each other. But I actually think that that mixture of traditions is very much not complete. And there's still a lot of heterogeneity going on. And in particular, we're not all familiar with each other's tools yet in a way that enables us to be sort of working optimally. So there are a lot of applications of substructural logic, for example, in computer science or in linguistics, where there seems to be a tendency to, once someone thinks that a substructural logic is required, they grab onto linear logic and go to work with that. And that's great. Linear logic is lovely. I think linear logic really, really has its charms and is valuable for many purposes and has resulted in a lot of good work stemming from this. But at least some of that good work stemming from this sort of hasn't stepped back and looked at questions that you might ask about distribution of conjunction over disjunction. This is one of the core differences between kind of linear logic influenced tradition on the one hand and the relevant logic tradition influenced tradition on the other, are questions about how conjunction and disjunction interact with each other. And, you know, if your training comes out of one of these traditions, like mine comes from the relevant tradition, it becomes, I think, incumbent upon you to start thinking about, okay, well, in this application that I have, do I really want to be drawing on a relevant logic, or is that just what I happen to know? Do I want to be looking over at a more linear tradition, or do I want to be grabbing something out of other sort of other substructural traditions that have come through? What really is the best for the purpose at hand? And I think there's, as I say, these streams are definitely flowing together and continuing, but I think a lot of research remains to be done on kind of interfaces between these sorts of things and what how to rig up systems that really work the best for the particular purpose at hand, thinking about the full range of options we have available. Another thing that's going on, a lot of sort of standard books on substructural logic and so on either won't mention at all or will mention only in passing kinds of either non-transitive systems of the kind that I've talked about, or non-reflexive systems that in which it's not the case that every sentence entails itself. These transitivity and reflexivity are rules that are sort of borderline cases of structural rules. Some authors count them as structural rules, other authors don't count them as structural rules. And the interaction between logics that are substructural in these ways, non-transitive and non-reflexive logics, and other kinds of substructural logics is, I think, really not well understood. And one of the things that I've been motivated by for a long time and am slowly learning more and more about, but intend to continue pursuing myself, is really thinking hard about relations between contraction on the one hand, which is a very well-studied structural rule in a range of contexts, and transitivity on the other. There's something deeply in common between contraction and transitivity in that they both involve a double use. Contraction involves using a premise twice and counting it as though you've used it once. Transitivity, this linking together of arguments, involves using your validity relation twice and counting yourself as having only used it once. So there's this real 2-to-1 move involved in contraction and transitivity, and that's a surface appearance, but I genuinely believe the connection's much deeper than that. But I don't yet have my own head around them. I haven't seen too much other work that really is trying to explore intimately exactly what these connections are between things like contraction and transitivity. So I think there's a lot of this is at the theoretical end. I think there's a lot of theoretical work to be done in substructural logics in terms of understanding the space of systems we have available to us and how they relate to each other and what kinds of tools work on them. As far as applications, substructural logics have huge applications in a range of different places, including, as I mentioned, both linguistics and computer science are kind of key areas for application of substructural logics. And those applications continue apace, but I think they will also be aided by this sort of theoretical work of getting a clearer picture of what our options are and how they relate to each other.
Hey, you mentioned that there's this sort of history, and you said at some point it became self-conscious. Actually, this is something I've been curious about, and I forgot to ask you earlier. But when did substructural logic, as its own sort of field, start to become a sort of?
Oh, look, I'm no historian, but I'm just going to look up when the first book called Substructural Logics was, though, because I don't. I think it's maybe 2000 or a little later. Yeah. Certainly the referring to things as substructural, I'm just not grabbing it, but okay, here we go. So I'm just giving you Wikipedia here. The first conference on the topic was October 1990 in Tübingen. It was called Logics with Restricted Structural Rules. And it was during that conference that Kostadocian proposed the term substructural logics, which is now standard now. So 1990, right? So it's, it's older than, it's older than Nevermind, but it's not older than Nirvana. Yeah. Right. That gives you a sort of a relatively tight sort of thing. Now, I assume, right, by the time that conference gets organized, presumably there's already some sort of self-consciousness developing. But I do think that the tradition itself does arise from these different sources, and that mixture really still hasn't shaken all the way out.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. This was a really, really interesting introduction to something that I'm personally starting to just sort of dig into. So I appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's been a blast. Thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.